Virginia, let's talk about Colorado and TCU, because this might have been the game that everybody is talking about from week one. And I think rightfully so, considering what happened in this game. You had Shadur Sanders, Deion Son break. I think I've seen a few school records, passing records already at Colorado in his first game, a game in which he threw for 510 yards. It has really kind of picked up the buzz on him. I think his NIL valuation has gone up by a million. So he's had himself a good week. And then also Travis Hunter, the former number one overall recruit from a couple years ago, who followed Deion to Jackson State, followed him to Colorado, and played both ways. And, you know, I got to give the man credit. You know, he played 129 snaps, played both ways on offense and defense. I got to give him credit for going out there in the Texas heat and just going out there and just balling, because that's what he did. As a corner, you know, defense didn't test him a whole lot, had a couple of broken up passes. He had a one crucial interception where he just dove out, laid himself out, and caught it and turned the ball over and got it back to the Colorado offense. Then on the offensive side, he had 16 targets, I believe, 16, 19 targets, 11 catches, 119 yards. Just had himself a day. And then Dylan Edwards, the freshman that was brought in at running back, he had himself a good day as well. So the future is bright there if he's able to keep up that type of production. But man, oh man, this was an incredible performance, I think. And I think there's a lot of talk about, are we kind of overreacting? And I think despite whatever happens the rest of the way with Colorado's season, whether they go 4-8 or 8-4, I think we will kind of remember this game as Colorado, the team that went on the road as 27.5-point underdogs. And or maybe that was Texas State, but they went in as huge underdogs in this game. Went into a stadium, played a program that just played for the national championship last year. And they played him in a game in which the coach's son and Shadur Sanders broke all those records, had himself an amazing day, and he had Travis Hunter play both ways in the heat, 129 snaps, and do the stuff that he was able to do. That is remarkable. That is something I think we're going to take away from that. And also, the thing that I think we have to think about here is, are other teams going to look at the Colorado model if it's successful and kind of try to apply that? Because we know in sports, in college sports and pro sports, there's teams that like to copycat other teams if it works out. If a certain offense is starting to work out, certain system, like, hey, let's try this. You know, what comes to mind to me is going back to Tennessee, see somebody like Alex Golish, who ran the offense as the offensive coordinator last year, attempt to try to run the same thing with USF. And I think there's one common denominator, and that's Heupel. And so it's going to be tough for anybody to try to replicate that. And I do kind of think that's going to be the same thing here with what's going on at Colorado. Because how many coaches are out there that are like Deion, a guy that is in the NFL Hall of Fame, one of the best corners to play in the National Football League, and is a guy that has just a magnetic personality where it's just you gravitate towards him, and he is like 100% believing in you and all this stuff, and saying like, "Hey, you," like with Travis Hunter at the halftime interview, it's like he is him. And so it's like, how many coaches are there like that? Deion is a one of one. So I think for other programs to try to figure that out, it would be kind of foolish. But there's another example of this happening here this past weekend. Texas State, who was a 27.5-point underdog, going on the road at Baylor, in which he was like, okay, Baylor is going to be fine. Texas State, they were kind of the same boat as Colorado, bringing in a whole lot of new guys on that roster, really revamping it, bringing in 51 new guys, and they went upset Baylor on the road. I was like, okay, well, maybe there's a little bit something here, but I think programs need to be wary of being able to do this and go for the fast rebuild. I think now in the age of the transfer portal and NIL, I think it's probably a little bit more easier to try to rebuild a program pretty really quickly than it has been in the past. When normally it would take 2 to 3 years. I think of something like what's going on in Florida, where it's like just wait a couple or 3 years. I don't think athletic directors have that patience anymore. I think they're like, let's go and let's go win now. And I think you need to be wary of going out and hiring coaches and saying, hey, if you don't do this in 2 years, you're out the door. So I think you need to be wary of that. But man, oh man, what a huge statement win by Colorado and by Coach Prime. I mean, this was amazing. And, there are probably going to be some people that are going to complain about the antics and all that stuff. I will say this: winning cures all. We've heard that statement time in and time out. And I think that could be the case here. Now, maybe if Colorado struggles a little bit, maybe some are like, okay, we're a little bit tired of what's going on here, what you're doing here. Get us results. But here in week 1, he got results. And I think, as far as anything that you have that's going on with Dion and like how he's handling himself in the program, winning cures all. So if Colorado keeps on winning, nobody's going to give a crap. If we're being honest, nobody's going to care about what's going to go on. But I mean, what a statement win at TCU, a team that just played in the national title game last year. Now, yes, TCU isn't the same team from a year ago. We talked about our Big 12 preview, but man, what a big time statement win by Colorado and Coach Prime, going to Fort Worth and upsetting TCU and the Texas Heat, and you got your son breaking passing records in his first game, and you got a guy playing both ways and producing results on both sides. So I mean, tip of the hat to Dion and what he's got going on in Colorado, and we'll have to see. He's got a big game this week against Nebraska, who did not get the job done in their first game under Matt Rule. So it should be a fun one. And Colorado is now ranked. So yeah, good times are rolling over in Colorado, and we'll see if they can keep this going. Carolinas, let's talk a little bit about LSU here. Of course, being blown out by Florida State. This is not the ideal opening week. I do think there's some similarities potentially from a team that we saw last year with Oregon. If you remember how Oregon Georgia went first game of the season last year, Oregon just completely got manhandled in that game. And we saw how they bounced back. They had a really good season and got in the double-digit win totals. I think that could be the case here with LSU. Besides Alabama, besides potentially A&M, their schedule is actually pretty favorable. They should be favored to win in most of the remaining games that they have the rest of the way. So there's potential for them to be this year's Oregon of 2022. It's entirely possible. Probably the one thing I want to especially talk about here is Harold Perkins. We talked about him and how awesome he was in his freshman year, how awesome he was at getting to the quarterback, generating pressure. And in this game, and I believe we talked about it in our previews, moved to inside linebacker. See how he is there. I think they need to move him back to where he was last year. I know, try to help him in development and all that stuff. I think you need to get him where he's best suited, is doing what he was doing last year. I mean, that's going to be what earns him the money at the next level. That's what's going to get him drafted, not being an inside linebacker. We've seen inside linebackers get drafted before here recently, and it hasn't panned out well. Devin Bush, Devin White, Perkins last year, that kind of need to be the player that you need to build around on this defense, not moving him to inside linebacker. I think that's just kind of silly. Now, maybe they see how it is one game, and maybe then it's like, okay, well, we need some more juice on this defense. Let's move him back to what he was doing last year. And I think that should be the case. I mean, last year, if you look at it per PFF, Pro Football Focus, Perkins rushed the passer on well over 55% of opponent dropbacks. On Sunday, it was just 7 times out of 58 snaps. That can't be the case here. And yes, I know you brought in some guys to help you out on the edges, but Perkins was a difference maker for you all last year and getting pressure on the quarterback, making him think, getting it into space really quickly. I think that needs to be the case this year. And I think that's where he can realize his full potential on this level and at the next level. Getting after the quarterback is going to get him paid. And yes, being an inside linebacker, we've seen a lot of them get paid. That's not going to get him paid more than being a guy that can get after the quarterback. Those guys, you pay them a lot of money to do that. And I think that's where Perkins is probably best suited, is to go after the quarterback and creating havoc up front with opposing offensive lines and opposing quarterbacks. But besides him, as far as LSU as a whole, they had a couple opportunities that they just absolutely missed, and really kind of question marks there. Jane Daniels, I think he's going to be fine, but I am a little bit worried about like with how well Florida State they were able to handle both LSU's offense and defense on both sides of the ball. LSU just looked like a team that just did not want to be there at the end a little bit, and that's not great. That's not something you want to see early on. With LSU's offense, you didn't have your three running backs, so well, we'll see how the running game develops here later on. You don't have John Emery, Amari Goodwin, and you don't have Logan Diggs, and Notre Dame transfer. I mean, the running game is going to suffer a little bit. So once you get them three back, maybe it should be better. Corner was a position that was addressed in the portal. You get Deuce Chestnut, Zy Alexander, and they just got absolutely feasted on. Johnny Wilson and Keon Coleman. And we'll talk about Florida State here in a bit, but they absolutely feasted on those two guys, and that's definitely not what you want to see out of your corners in week one. But maybe Wilson and Coleman are just that good. But LSU, there's a lot of questions here. I still think they'll be fine. But if Bama, I think, can beat Texas week and beat them pretty easy and beat them pretty handedly, then I think there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be back on the Bama's going to win the West bandwagon. Uh, and maybe this game kind of did some damage to the thought of LSU winning it again this year. But moving on to the Florida State side of things, I mean, Jordan Travis had himself a couple bad plays, but I mean, this guy did really well, particularly in the second half. Looked like a guy that is going to be a potential Heisman candidate. Looks like he's going to be one right now, or in the early onset of the season. And then just Keon Coleman, the transfer from Michigan State, big wide receiver, had himself a day at the office. And when we talk about the wide receiver position and as far as next year's draft, you know who the number one guy is, and Marvin Harrison Jr. And he did not have a good first game. And we'll kind of talk about some of the new quarterbacks here, but he did not have himself a good game. But that's not going to deter him from being number one wide receiver next year. But who's going to be the number two receiver? If Keon Coleman's able to have performances like this here the rest of the season, he's got the Clemson game coming up. If he's able to just feast on opposing corners like this, he could find himself in the conversation to be wide receiver two behind Harrison Jr. Because he's a big receiver, 6'3", 6'4", 210. He was able to go out and make plays and just run all over everybody. He could find himself in that conversation. But Florida State, this was a big, huge exclamation point win for them and their season. And what a lot of people think of them as potentially being a team that could go and win a national championship. If they're able to continue to do this, we'll have to see how Clemson is, but it could set up to be a really good season down in Tallahassee. So now moving on, speaking of Clemson, let's talk about that. And man, this is going to be a really interesting conversation. To start off this, I actually could not believe that this was real. I could, but I couldn't. At the end of the first half against Duke, Dabo said of new offense coordinator Garrett Riley is there to run the quote unquote Clemson offense. And it kind of brought me back to the coach that coached the Arkansas State team that lost 73-0 this past weekend and was consoled in a viral video going around by one of his players. It reminds me of kind of that same mindset and where guys were brought in, where there was a new offensive coordinator or a new defensive coordinator that were brought in. It's like, hey, you're here to run this system. Well, you're great, but we want you to run our system. And I think this is going to be a thing that is probably going to be the downfall of Dabo right here. It's just fitting them into just like this square box and saying, we want you to run the offense that we run, not what you ran at TCU, the offense that we run. Because I think we all thought that Clemson was going to be able to was going to have some elements of the TCU offense from last year, and Garrett Riley was going to carry them over with Klubnik and the guys that they have here in 2023. But no, it just did not look anything like that. And it may be the fact that Dabo's inability to adjust and adapt, whether that is with coaching hires like this, or whether it's something like NIL or the transfer portal, that may be a thing that ends him and Clemson's championship window here. Now we'll have to see how they do against Florida State here in a couple weeks. But I mean, in game one, losing to Duke the way they did, it's not entirely great. It's not. And I think of another thing. You think of how the way Nick Saban and Alabama were in the late 2000s, early on in Saban's tenure there. And then and kind of saw the explosive offenses that kind of gave him trouble there. Oklahoma, I think, is a team that what gave him a little bit trouble with how their offenses were ran there. And I think he saw what was going on there. And so, what are the great ones to do? They adapted. And that's, I think, what's been the key to extending Alabama's dynasty as far as it's gone. If Saban didn't make that change, maybe we're not talking about the Alabama dynasty anymore. Who knows? We don't know how history would play out. But I think with him adapting, that really extended the lifespan of the dynasty there in Tuscaloosa for several more years. Is being able to adapt to a new kind of offense and they were running. And you've seen what they've done here, with all the quarterbacks they put in, all the receivers they put in the NFL the last few years. That's a key product of what Saban's adaptation to the times has done. And I think Dabo's at a crossroads here. He's got to be able to adapt, and maybe that can extend what's going on in Clemson a little while longer, or just say we're going to keep doing this thing we're doing and go down the road where it's like it's not going to end great. The roster now, it used to have players that were like, you look at their roster, Bama's roster, Ohio State's roster, is like there's about an equal talent playing field here that you see here. And it's kind of gone the opposite way for Clemson. And you really start to wonder, was DJ Uiagalelei the problem for Clemson? You saw how he did at Oregon State here in week one. Did pretty well for himself. Looked like a different kind of quarterback than he was at Clemson. So you got to wonder, was he the problem? Was he the issue? And I think we're starting to see, like, he is not the issue here. And yes, the Clemson offense produced a lot of high-level talent, but that's because he had a generational quarterback too. I think he add that into there. And I don't know if Klubnik is necessarily a part of that conversation of being a generational quarterback, because he had Deshaun Watson, he had Trevor Lawrence there, and they were just able to do amazing things for so many years. So it's tough times, I think, in Clemson. I think Dabo doesn't learn to adapt with the NIL transfer portal and with all this stuff, and letting Garrett Riley implement the offense he had at TCU. It might be a tough season for Clemson. And this is me after a week ago saying I'm picking Clemson to win the ACC, and that I can't, Clemson built up too much good faith in picking somebody else. I got to pick them, So a little bit of a change of tune from a week ago, but man, oh man, there's some questions in Clemson that need to be answered, especially the one of Dabo and whether he's willing to adapt or not. And if he's not, then he's probably not going to be at Clemson, I don't think, much longer.